Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today, I have on with me Gregg Snyder from Grain and Barrel. You probably know him better from the brand Chicken Cock, with Grain and Barrel being the larger company. Gregg, welcome on.
Thanks, David. Pleasure to be here.
So, Chicken Cock kind of exploded onto the scene a couple of years ago when it got revived. And of course, there's the name. People are a little, they always get up about the name, but the fact is that the product was actually quite solid. It was a really good product, the bourbon and the rye. I'm actually partial to the bourbon, which is rare for me. I usually go more towards the rye, but the bourbon got me. But today in particular, we're going to be talking about the newest release, the Island Rooster. So the rum finished bourbon. So
actually a rum finished rye.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the rum finished rye. Can't read my own notes sometimes. So yes, the rum finished rye. Thank you. So, before we get into that, Greg, I just want to give you the chance to kind of give a little history of yourself. You've been in the industry for, I think, Aaron said 41 years.
Actually, I'm in my 45th year, David. So,
45th year. Yeah. All right. I promise my other notes are much better than these initial ones. So with that, just take it away.
Okay. Well, I actually got started in this industry in 1978. I graduated from Indiana University with a business management degree. And, your senior year, there were companies that would come to career placement. And if they were looking to recruit people, they would put a sign-up sheet on the wall. And if you were interested in interviewing with that company, you signed up. And then luckily you got the interview. And so one of the companies I interviewed with and one of the job opportunities I was given was a frontline supervisory position with Joseph E. Seagram and Son. At that time, they had a facility in Louisville, Kentucky, and I grew up most of my life in southern Indiana, right across from Louisville. So it was home, and that's how I got into it. Seagram's was a great training ground. If you wanted to learn and you picked up things quick, they kind of gave you an opportunity. And I was kind of put on a fast track and literally worked in every department within that facility. In the 5 years it was open in 1983, like many other distilling companies, they consolidated. The bourbon industry was on a decline, and so they kind of consolidated. But during my time there, I actually worked in the distillery and dryer house. I worked in the barrel warehouse, filling barrels, putting barrels in rigs, taking them out, dumping barrels, gauging tanks, filtration, blending, processing, receiving, shipping, bottling, quality, maintenance, you name it. I got an opportunity to work in every department, and it gave me a good exposure to everything and how they interact. And so it was, as I said, it was a great training ground for me. But when they shut that facility down, I had an opportunity to relocate. And instead of, I was going to end up in New York City. Basically, I was going to go up to manage a warehouse facility they had in Shannon, Ohio, right outside of Lawrenceburg, Indiana. And I was going to be there about 9 to 12 months, they said, and then they were going to move me to New York City to the corporate office. And I said, that's not my game plan. I didn't really care to move to New York City, but part of the severance package, they pay for my education for 1 year. And I was able to work it out with Brown-Forman University, where I got my MBA in 1 year's time, and Seagram paid for every penny of it. So that was a great, a great opportunity, and kind of paved my my career going forward. And shortly thereafter, I went to work for Brown-Forman. Started out as the manager on their bottling operation in the afternoon shift, and did that for a little over a year. Then I got a promotion. I was in charge of all the materials, all the dry goods, the bottles, the boxes, the closures, everything the bottling needed. I was responsible for making sure that we had it in inventory and available when they needed it. And then after about 9 months of doing that, they added responsibility, and I got responsibility in addition to the dry goods for all the wet goods, tank trucks of Canadian mist coming down from Collingwood, Canada, or tank trucks coming up from Mexico, Pepe Lopez tequila. And then I also had responsibility for the early times warehouse operation, the barrel warehouse. So I actually, in total, I worked for Brown-Forman for 12 years, but a little over 9 of those 12 years, I managed their cooperage operations. I got a promotion and went out to Blue Grass Cooperage at the time. Now they call it Brown-Forman Cooperage, because they actually have one down in Alabama too. So they call it Brown-Forman Cooperages. But Blue Grass Cooperage was the name of that, and I managed their cooperage operations for a little over 9 years. So, I not only made whiskey and aged whiskey and bottled and shipped whiskey. Now I learned quite a bit about how important that barrel is. 60 to 70% of the flavor in a good bottle of whiskey actually comes from that white oak barrel. So it's a critical component to a high quality whiskey. Did that. So I was told Brown-Forman, I was there a little bit over 12 years, but then I got an opportunity and I went to work for Pernod Ricard. They owned a company called Wild Turkey. I was actually the vice president of Austin Nichols and the managing director to Wild Turkey Distillery. And I did that for a little over 10 years. And that was a great opportunity career-wise. And, I enjoyed, Jimmy Russell, Eddie Russell, both worked for me during that time period. But a great group of people down in Anderson County there in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, and enjoyed that time. From there, I ended up going up to Maine. And I managed a facility called White Rock Distilleries. You may be familiar with them, a small privately owned company. The biggest brand we had when I worked there was Pinnacle Vodka. We basically created the dessert category of flavored vodka, and it did quite well. It was actually the fastest growing spirit, not just vodka, but fastest growing spirit for 3 consecutive years. And in 2012, Jim Beam acquired Pinnacle Vodka along with a small rum brand and the plant assets. And they asked me to move back to Kentucky and head up the transition of those brands into their facility in Frankfort, their bottling facility in Frankfort. So I did that. Transition took a little over a year. And then I left and went to work for a company called Western Spirits down in Bowling Green, Kentucky, as their vice president of operations. You may be familiar with some of their products, Bird Dog whiskeys, Calumet Farm Bourbon, Sam Houston Bourbon, some of those items. But I live or still live in Southern Indiana. It was about a 2-hour drive down there. And so it's a little bit too long to commute. So I was living and working in Bowling Green during the week and then driving home on weekends. And I did that for a little over 3.5 years, but my wife was having some health issues and it's just kind of got too difficult. So that's when I decided to ramp up my retirement plan. And that was not retire, but start my own consulting business. So in June of 2017, I started my own consulting business, and Grain and Barrel Spirits was one of the first clients I actually picked up. I started out helping them with some supply chain issues and some operational things, but then the founder of the company, Amadi Antla, who acquired the Chicken Cock brand in 2011, he approached me one day and says, I have this vision of wanting to resurrect Chicken Cock back to Kentucky, resurrect it back to Kentucky and bring it back to its high quality prominence. He said, could you help me do that? Would you serve in the role of master distiller? And so I agreed to that on terms and so forth. And so that's kind of what I've been helping them do for a little over 5 years now. And I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to come up with in some of the quality offerings we've shared.
I mean, it's a hell of a history. It actually, so in preparation for these interviews, I was listening to kind of other episodes, other interviews that people have done to try to get as much info as I can for new questions and things like that. And you answered one of them right off the bat, which was how the hell you got all that cooperage experience, because that's not a normal thing. A master distiller will maybe know the basics of it, they'll know why the wood is so important, but to be coopering is a very different thing. But jumping back to kind of not quite the beginning, but I do have to say, I won't hold it against you that you didn't want to move to New York City. Thank
you.
it's where I've lived most of my life. So
God bless you, man. I think it's one of those places that it's a great place to visit, but it really isn't something that fits my lifestyle. So
totally fine. I was in a master's program. I always tell people I was in a master's program, 25 of us in the cohort. I was the only native New Yorker and the only person who had lived in New York City before. Only one of the other 24 wanted to stay after their degree. Everyone was like, this is way too much. I got to get out of here. Like, I can't do the subway. It's too crowded. So I do understand. I won't hold it against you. You also skipped over something at Wild Turkey that I wanted to mention. You were just on my friend Perry's podcast. This is my bourbon podcast.
Okay. Yeah.
And on that one and on one other, you also mentioned that when you were VP at Austin Nichols and managing director for Wild Turkey, you started a certain brand that's kind of grown since then.
Yeah, I let me elaborate on that a little bit. I hadn't been there very long, probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. And, the top management at Pernod Ricard came to me and said, we think we have too much whiskey. You mind taking a look at it and letting us know? I said, I can do that. But I said, I need to know what your sales forecasts are going out into the future. Hmm. And so they said, well, just take all the brands and figure 2% growth for the next 3 years. And I said, well, that's great. But in order to do it properly, you got some 12-year-old whiskeys. I need to know out at least 12 years. Mm-hmm. And so to keep it simple, they said, well, just figure 2% growth on all the different brands for the next 12 years. And so I had this, I call it a liquidation distillation model. It's just a simple Excel spreadsheet that I developed actually when I was at Brown-Forman. And so I used this and plugged in their sales forecast and ran the numbers. And so I had a meeting up in New York City to kind of go over this. And we had actually some of the top brass from France was there. We had the finance folks there, the marketing folks there. And I said, the answer is this. I said, you don't have too much whiskey, but you have too much old whiskey. Hmm. And they looked a little puzzled and said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, for quite a while now, the finance group out of the offices, the headquarters in New York City, were telling the folks down in Kentucky what barrels to pull to dump for the various products. And at that time, of course, Wild Turkey 101 was probably 75 to 80% of the total volume. And for Wild Turkey 101, they were using 6.5-year-old Wild Turkey bourbon. Mm-hmm. Well, the next year would roll around, and now this product they were using last year, they weren't using it. Well, you go back and look back 6.5, 7 years prior to that, they were making far more whiskey than what they were dumping and bottling in the current day that I was doing this study. And so another year would roll around, and the finance folks said, well, no, we can't use that 7-year-old now or 7.5-year-old because it's another year older. There's another year of ad valorem taxes. There's more evaporation. And so our component cost is going to increase. We can't increase our component costs. Well, that went on for a number of years. And I said, guys, you've got to bite the bullet. You got to use it. Now, you start blending it off, not in high percentages so you dramatically change the taste profile, but you got to use it. You got to, it's going to bump your component cost up a little bit. But, hopefully through other efforts, we can kind of, keep some of the cost in check, if not do better on some of the cost. And so I said, that's one of the options. Second option is you can try to sell barrel goods on the open market. Well, and this was in 1998. 1998, nobody was buying, mature whiskey in a barrel, not like it is today. Right. And so, but I said the third option, I said, we can come up with a new bourbon brand. I said, you know what? It's high time this company paid tribute to one of the greatest master distillers that ever walked this earth, and that's Jimmy Russell. And they looked at each other and said, yeah, that's a great idea, but what would we call it? And I said, well, for lack of a better term, or better name, why don't we call it Russell's Reserve? And so that's actually how Russell's Reserve came about. It's paying tribute to Jimmy Russell. And Jimmy didn't know anything about this was going on. And so I was in New York the following Monday. I was back in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, and met up with Jimmy that morning like I did most mornings before I even turned my computer on, walking around the plant. And I said, Jimmy, I said, the company's looking at coming out with a new bourbon. I said, as I recall, we've got some great 10-year-old bourbon on the 4th floor of B Warehouse. You mind grabbing a sample of that? Let's look at that today. He said, okay. So later on that day, I had a meeting with the union, and we were wrapping up things, and I heard this knock on the door, and it's Jimmy. And he said, you got a minute? I said, yeah, come on in, Jimmy. We're wrapping up. And he brought this little snifter glass, and he said, here's that sample you want to try. And he handed it to me, and I got it a foot from my nose. And man, the caramel and vanilla just knocked my head off my shoulders. It was so beautiful. It was awesome. And so, again, long story short, I'm rambling here a little bit, but I worked with the packaging group and the marketing group, and we developed the package for it. And again, Jimmy didn't know anything about this, but we came out originally in the tall standard Wild Turkey bottle. And it was screen printed, said Wild Turkey's Russell's Reserve Bourbon, 10-year-old. And it was a 101 proof at that time. And so once we got everything put together and before we scheduled the bottling, we kind of had a little presentation, and Jimmy shed a few tears over that. Was pretty proud of it. And the brand's done extremely well. I'm happy for Jimmy and the Russell family.
Yeah, it is. I know it's a favorite of many of my friends and who are with Wild Turkey or have a lot of Wild Turkey on their shelves. They tend to either go for either Russell's Reserve, the 10-year-old, or pick, of course. Um, Either that or the rare breed. And they go back and forth between the two. Different profiles, but I know it's a love of theirs. And as I was hearing you, as I heard you talking about the story, the image that kind of sticks in my mind is this idea that um, that Jimmy Russell, who at that time was already 40 years into his master distilling, or his distilling career, I should say, and had become master distiller. And even though, of course, you're also a very high up in the company, that he's just does this little knock on the door and like peeks his head and he's like, "Hey, you got a minute?" And it's just such a, for me, it's a weird juxtaposition between that and this larger than life, the Bourbon Buddha, has won every award kind of guy that you see nowadays or in the last couple of years. Is I'll admit I've only been in talking about whiskey, drinking whiskey for a couple of years now. So the only Jimmy Russell that I've known is that guy, the one, he's got a big belly, he's leaning over a barrel with Eddie next to him, maybe Bruce if it's a more recent one. But just this idea that he's like, yeah, just take a walk over to Warehouse P and try this thing from the fourth floor. I'm like, hey, you got a minute? I don't know why. It's hilarious to me, and I love it because it's a mark of kind of also humility too. He's not barging in like, I'm the master distiller. Here, try this. So
Jimmy's a great guy. He's a dear friend and always will be.
Fantastic. And I have to admit, I've been down there twice. I'm now coming back from a couple of days after coming back from a trip to Kentucky and Tennessee. Next time I'm hoping to come over to your place, of course, to see things, but
sure.
And your workplace, I should clarify, your workplace to see things. And but I've been to Wild Turkey twice now. Unfortunately, it's just not the days that Jimmy was there. I know he likes to go there Sundays after church, but I just didn't line up. But I'm hoping you can see him, take a picture with them, because you gotta take a picture with the guy.
Sure. Yeah, he's special. He's a very special guy.
Yep. So I definitely want to just go back to that. So I'm skipping around a little bit in your career before we get to the newest phase, the chicken cock phase, just because there were a couple of stories that I wanted to expand upon and get a little more out of, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So one of them that you mentioned, I think on Perry's podcast, but also on Bourbon Tangent or Whiskey Tangent, which was that when you were at Brown-Forman, that early Woodford was really Old Forester.
That's correct.
So I don't really know a lot about those two brands. I wasn't really a fan of either one of them until the Old Forester started coming out with some high proof stuff, and then I became more of a fan. I'm still not a huge Woodford fan, but again, we're talking the modern, whatever's on the shelf right now. I haven't really tasted any Dusties or anything like that. So what was that transition like when it was going from brand to brand? You have the two brands working together and sometimes being in each other's bottles.
So in 1996 is when actually Brown-Forman had their grand opening of the back then it was called Brown Graham Distillery, and then they eventually changed the name to Woodford Reserve. But the first day that they had the grand opening, they filled the first barrel, and Owsley Brown, who was CEO at that time, and Paul Patton was the governor of Kentucky, he was there, and they had a big ceremony where both of them signed the first barrel. But that same day, you could actually buy Woodford Reserve on the shelf. Now, when I worked at Brown-Forman, the only offerings they had of Old Forester, that was the 86 proof, which was 4.5-year-old bourbon, and their 100 proof, they're bonded. And so those were the only two Old Foresters that were on the shelf back then. Since then, they've come out with a full line of variations in that. But, like other companies, just like Wild Turkey, years previous, 4.5 years ago, they made a heck of a lot more bourbon than what they were bottling current day. And so they had a surplus in inventory. And so that first day in 1996, when they barreled the first barrel, the whiskey that was actually in the Woodford Reserve bottle was 7.5-year-old Old Forester. And I loved Old Forester. I really liked it. I mean, whenever we'd have Brown-Forman functions, of course, Jack Daniels is a cash cow, and I like Jack because I get down to Lynchburg at least once a month when I was in the barrel side of the business. But whenever there was a corporate function, I'd always go with the Old Forester. I really liked the bourbon. And then later on, I went with the Woodford because 7.5-year-old Old Forester to me definitely beats the 4.5-year-old. And that's the way it was till 6 years. And to kind of elaborate a little more on that story, Lincoln Henderson. I don't know if you ever knew Lincoln or remember the name, but Lincoln Henderson was the master distiller for Woodford when they first started Woodford Reserve in 1996. And Lincoln worked in the lab, a great guy. And when we were starting up that distillery, I was on the executive production committee. And Lincoln and I kind of went round and round, and he was given a direction to try to get as many proof gallons per bushel of grain as you could. And so they were coming off the still. To be a bourbon, there's 4 primary criteria that the government spells out. Number 1, you have to have at least 51% corn in the mash bill. Number 2, it can't come off the still higher than 160 proof. Number 3, it has to be aged in a new charred oak barrel. And number 4, it can't go into a barrel higher than 125 proof. So if you meet those 4 criteria, basically it's bourbon day one, it goes into that new barrel. And so Lincoln, in order to get as many proof gallons per bushel, they were coming off the still right at 159, 160 proof. And I pleaded with Lincoln, I said, don't do it. You're going to strip all the flavor out. The higher you proof it, the more the flavor you're stripping out of it. And he said, that was the directive I was given, Greg. So that's what, we're trying to achieve. Well, 6 years later, after they barreled the first barrel, 6 years later, they pulled that barrel out of the warehouse, and it was not good. It was not good at all. I mean, it was flavorless. Mm-hmm. And so even then, I think they were using about 90% of the 7.5-year-old Old Forester with about 10% of what they were actually distilling down at the distillery. Now, today, I have no idea what it is. I know they've made some adjustments since that time. And but yeah, that's a true story. And then there's probably still some relatively aged Old Forester still in the mixture.
To your knowledge, I know shortly thereafter, you were moving over to Austin Nichols and Wild Turkey, but to your knowledge, was Lincoln able to reduce that proof off the still?
I don't think he did while he was there. That was kind of the directive that they were sticking with, and when they actually made some adjustments, I really couldn't tell. Lincoln ended up retiring from Brown-Forman, and actually, you probably know this, but he was actually one of the co-founders of Angel's Envy.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's going to come up a little bit later as well.
Okay.
And I think you know why, so that's fine. Interesting. So I'm going to have to go back and see. I have a couple of friends who have some early Woodford, some old Forester, and see what it tastes like. There's always a little difference in those Dusties. So, and they come as Dusties now. So
yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So the next stop that I just wanted to mention briefly, because I'm like to be transparent, the stop at Western Spirits. So like I said, Bird Dog, Calumet Farms, Sam Houston. I have to be honest, I'm pretty sure someone higher up at Western Spirits really does not like me now.
Why is that?
I have never had Bird Dog. Calumet Farms I enjoyed. I wrote a review of Sam Houston, one of the, I forget which state it was either New York or the Kentucky batch. It was 3 barrels per state. And I wrote a review, and it wasn't a bad review. I said, I just want a little more proof. There's something I felt like it was missing something, but it wasn't a negative review necessarily. But I think the part that kind of irked him was that I'm big on questioning the marketing aspect of things. And my question really was, I just want to know how it came about that it's a Kentucky whiskey, source Kentucky whiskey, named after a Texas hero, nationally known, of course, but a Texas hero who, to our knowledge, never distilled a drop in his life. It felt like a disconnect with me. I'm like, there's so many figures in Kentucky lore still available to build the brand around. Why would you do a Kentucky bourbon with a Texas figure? You know what I mean? Like there's Lincoln bourbon now, which is also sourced, but I mean, Lincoln was born in Kentucky, so that there's a connection there at least. So I was given an introduction to this person. I forget the name right now. And I think that's probably for the best. And, but I never heard back. And then the person who tried to make the introduction, she kind of mentioned offhand, yeah, he wasn't a big fan of that review of yours. So I try to be honest in my reviews.
Okay.
That was really the biggest problem I had with the bourbon. I didn't think it was bad. I was just questioning the marketing aspect of it. So I'll throw it to you. I don't know if you were there during the time when that was being rolled out. But if so, I'm just curious about how that marketing decision might have come about.
So when I was there, David, Sam Houston was actually a blended whiskey. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think the impetus behind it was Texas is a huge whiskey market.
Sure.
And so they were trying to pull in some Texas folklore. And I think that's why I wasn't involved in these decisions. I mean, the brand existed when I started working there, but from everything that I could surmise, I think that that's what they were trying to do is bring some Texas, connection there to help sales in Texas, being such a huge market. But again, it was a blended whiskey back then. I mean, it had bourbon in it, but I think it had some pear flavor. It had different kind of flavors blended in with it. And, I wasn't a big fan of it when I worked there, but, and then he talked about bringing it back resurrecting it as a bourbon brand. And eventually they did. So, and I think that's why I can't speak to it because I wasn't there. Don't know definitively what the thought process was behind it, but the best I could tell was they were just trying to make some Texas connection there to help sales in Texas.
Look, that makes perfect sense and is a perfectly acceptable answer. Of course, I won't hold it to you as you representing the brand. I'm not doing that, but that's honestly all I was asking for in the review. It's just like just have the conversation with me because I wanted to know. I wasn't anyway. So that was my last thing on there. I just wanted to mention. So anyway, so you've gone through this incredible career already. We will come back to the cooperage part of it because that is a fascination of mine. But so you've semi-retired. You're moving into consulting, and this opportunity with Grain and Barrel comes up. Now, you've said that Marty came to you and said, this is a very old brand, a favorite in Harlem and Cotton Club in Harlem, a favorite of Duke Ellington's. It goes back a very long time, but hadn't been around in half century, 3/4 of a century at that point. I want to resurrect it not only as a brand, but also with the quality that it deserves and requires. When you were talking to Perry, you had mentioned, just as any young distillery, young product you need to have some cash flow. And in what you've described earlier, when you were at Austin Nichols, clearly the MBA puts you kind of at another level because you're understanding the business side from a real, like, here's the spreadsheet, here's the projection, this is what you need kind of viewpoint. So when you agreed to come on, what aspects of the brand in terms of reputation did you prioritize in promoting the quality over anything else?
So let's to give folks kind of a background. Earlier you mentioned about the name and how people kind of are taken back a little bit, let's say, by the name of the brand. And, when I do tastings all over the country, that's the first question I get. Where'd you come up with that name? And so I tell people, the brand originated in 1856 in Paris, Kentucky. It's an old brand with rich in tradition and history. But the gentleman that built this distillery, a guy by the name of James A. Miller, built a distillery in Paris, Kentucky in 1856. And he was making a whiskey he was so proud of, he felt it was worth crowing about. And that's why he called it chicken cock whiskey. Now, in 1856, Americans were still using the Old English language. And the term for a male chicken was a cock. The term rooster didn't come about until the late 1800s or early 1900s. And so that's how the brand got its name. Throughout the history, you mentioned the Cotton Club. It was a house whiskey at the Cotton Club during the Roaring '20s, and did well, had a high quality reputation after Prohibition was repealed. And then in the 1950s, early 1950s, the distillery had a fire and burnt to the ground. And the company that owned it decided not to rebuild, and the brand just sat idle. And then, as you said, over a half a century later, in 2011, actually, Monty was doing some research trying to find a whiskey brand. And he ran across the history of chicken cock and found it interesting. And so he was able to acquire the brand rights. But to the point you were making is that, Grain and Barrel is a small company. They don't have their own distillery, don't have their own operational assets. And so they needed cash flow. And the quickest way, the easiest way to do that, Monty was able to acquire some very young whiskey. They put it in an aluminum bottle. And they added some flavor. They had a cinnamon flavor, they had a root beer flavor, they had several different flavors, and it served its purpose. He brought the brand back as a flavored whiskey, and it served its purpose. It created cash flow. A little while later, again, he was still able to buy this young 6-month-old whiskey, and they came out with the Chicken Cock Heritage, which was bourbon, and then Chicken Cock Bootlegger, which was a bourbon rye blend. And again, it served its purpose. It created cash flow, but it didn't really do anything to help the quality reputation that the brand once had. And so once I think Grain and Barrel was able to pull in a few more investors and generate some cash flow, Monty knew its future was to really bring it back to its high quality prominence. And so that's when he hired my consulting services in 2017. And I'm not an actual employee of Grain and Barrel Spirits. I'm actually a paid consultant in my role of master distiller. So, but yeah, that's, he saw the future for the brand was back in the premium sector. And so that's kind of what we've done. And when he asked me, if would you help me resurrect it back to Kentucky, and would you serve in the role of master distiller? And that's what I told him. I'll do it on one condition. We stop buying this young crap, and let's truly focus and everybody focus on bringing it back to its high quality prominence. So far, that's what we've been able to do.
What do you think was the biggest hurdle that you faced in doing that, or was it really smooth sailing once you got Monty's backing?
Oh no, it's not smooth sailing, because one of the things from 2011 to 2017, I guess it was, the quality reputation took a hit. And when I started doing tastings and so forth, that was the biggest hurdle I had to get over. I mean, people say, "Oh, I've tasted it before. I don't want that rot gut." So, well, no, you haven't tasted this. And I kind of explain, what we did and what we were doing, and just like the Woodford Reserve story. Day one, you just can't, flip the switch and say, "Oh, I got magically aged whiskey now." When I started as master distiller, as you're probably aware of, David, we formed a relationship with Bardstown Bourbon Company, and that's the home of Chicken Cock whiskey now. That's where we're making it. So we started laying whiskey down. Well, to give that time, you got, like I said, number one, you got to have lots of money. Number two, you got to have lots of patience, because you got to let it age. And so to give it properly, enough time to properly age and mature, part of my responsibilities, I would go out and I'd try to find good quality whiskey that we could acquire and put under the Chicken Cock label to bridge the gap until ours became of age. And so we're getting that point now. This past year is the first whiskey that we've actually, the first bourbon we dumped to start using. And then a couple of years ago, when our rye came out, that was actually part of our relationship with Bardstown Bourbon Company. We actually produced that rye at Bardstown Bourbon Company, rye 100%. But the bourbon itself, what we have in the bourbon bottle today is not 100% of what we laid down. It's a little over 80% of our 4-year-old that we laid down, and then it's blended with some of the other stuff that I was able to acquire, some 7 and 15-year-old currently. But it's good bourbon. I think we've met the challenge of reestablishing the high quality reputation. And again, it's not easy. It's still, even today, occasionally I get people say, "Oh, I've tasted that years ago. I don't like it." It's, okay.
No, I understand. And the reputation question is hard because it's such a, you can lose reputation much quicker than you can gain it.
Absolutely.
And I think of a good parallel as Green River in Owensboro. You know, they're another very long storied brand and distillery that once was revived in 2014, 2015, kind of did these parallel processes of you had the calls on one side doing bourbon kind of the traditional way, do it well, age it well, let it sit. But for most of that time, also until about a year and a half ago, you also had that TerraPure system,
right,
for aging too. Distilleries renamed OZ Tyler temporarily. Now it's back to Green River, but the OZ Tyler name really took a hit on the quality and reputation of the brand. And I'm happy to say, at least from a consumer's perspective, from my perspective as a consumer, the Green River bourbon they put out earlier this year as their first, real product in a while was excellent. Wheelhorse whiskey, who I've talked to also, who sources from them, get bourbon and rye from them, and it's great. And they've moved the TerraPure out. But to overcome the reputation that other system had imparted was no small feat. They really had to come out with a banger product right away.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think another one that didn't quite work out yet, and I'm saying yet because I want to give them a little more time, was Castle and Key. The products I've had so far, I think they just need more time. But they're dealing with this huge reputation and length of history. You're on the site, you're next to the Doc Crow site. It's beautiful, but the whiskey's got to match the story and everything that goes along with it.
Right.
So with Chicken Cock being the house bourbon of one of the hottest clubs in Harlem during the Roaring 20s, during Prohibition, so of course would have been speakeasy style, but was still always made readily available, let's say, at the club. That's a big reputation to live up to. It's kind of like every decade I feel like has their bourbon that everyone has to match, and that was the one for Chicken Cock. So going over to the Bardstown Bourbon Company connection.
Okay.
So yes, did know that coming in, but of course always want to dig a little deeper. So forgive me, I forgot the phrase you used earlier, but it was basically about liquid strategy. You used it in reference to what you were doing at Wild Turkey when you saw they had too much old bourbon. It was liquidation
distillation model. I call it.
There you
go. It not only tells you what you need to have sitting in the warehouse to meet current days and future year sales, but also as you carry it out further, it tells you what you need to produce and lay down to meet even sales farther out into the future.
Right. So I'm going to write that down before I forget it again.
Okay.
All right. So I forget who I was talking to recently, another interview, and they were talking a lot about liquid strategy, which it covers the same ideas. You need to know not only how much you're going to sell, where you're going to sell it, make sure you have enough to backfill once you've sold that first set. You can't just sell what you have and then be like, whoop, got no more whiskey. You have to have a strategy to keep it going if you want to keep it going. Bardstown was an interesting case because they, as a distiller, had, before they put a brick down, they had their first year or two of production capacity sold already.
Right.
And in talking to David Mandel about kind of how that came about, he said they needed to make sure the cash flow was going to be there. They would contract distill for others, put down their own distillate as well, but most of their business at that time would be contract distilling. You're letting other people come into their kitchen. So by the time you're coming in with Chicken Cock, this is 2017. Bardstown's been around for a couple of years. It's still under, at that time, original ownership. Were you able to just go in and say, from day one of the relationship, these are the specs that we need for this bourbon? This is the temperature. This is the time. This is the yeast we're going to use, the mash bill, all that. And then, so that's the first part of the question, is were you able to do that day one? And then did you have to experiment to find that first?
So, yeah, I'd had a little, let's just say I had worked with those folks prior to Grain and Barrel Spirits when they had just broken ground. I was the vice president of operations at Western Spirits, and Steve Nally, the master distiller, is an old dear friend of mine. Steve just celebrated his 50th year in the industry, so he's been at it a few years longer than I have. But Steve and I go way back. I've probably known Steve 40 years, I'm guessing. But anyhow, just a great guy. And so when I reached out to him about producing some whiskey for Western Spirits, he connected me with David Mandel, and we hit it off. And so from day one, they were producing whiskey for Western Spirits. So since I had a previous relationship with them, getting Grain and Barrel Spirits involved was much easier. And so when I started helping Grain and Barrel Spirits, that was the first place I've recommended we go to. I mean, it's a great location. They're right off the Blue Grass Parkway, right on the Bourbon Trail. So you get all the exposure of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. And they've assembled one of the greatest teams I think this industry's ever seen. They've got a fabulous group of people there. They put in some fabulous equipment and keep upgrading the equipment, seems like every year. And they're making some fantastic whiskey. You mentioned contract distillation. Well, their program actually goes beyond contract distillation. There's distilleries out there that'll make whiskey, they'll put it in a barrel, and you can buy those barrels and it's yours. You just pay for the aging. Every year it sits, or every month it sits in a warehouse. You got to pay a fee and the associated expenses. But at Bardstown Bourbon Company, they have what they call a collaborative distillation program. And through that program, I was able to give them our mash bills. Our mash bill for our bourbon is 70% corn, 21 rye, and 9% malted barley. And then our mash bill for our rye is a 95 rye, 5% malted barley. But in addition to the mash bills, I gave them the work instructions. From my experience, my knowledge, I gave them the time and temperatures I wanted to cook the grains. I gave them the enzymes I want to use. I gave them the specifications for fermentation, beer chemistry, and distillation. And so that when they produce our bourbon or our rye, they get it on the schedule, they give me notice, and then I don't care if it's 2:00 in the morning on a Sunday morning, I'm there to kind of oversee the process and make sure they get it started right and following the work instructions right. Because they've got, I'm guessing, roughly 23 to 25 different companies they make whiskey for. And out of those companies, it's 50 some odd different mash bills. So it can get a little confusing sometimes, but again, they've got a great team and they're doing a fantastic job. And I couldn't be prouder to be associated with them.
Absolutely. And if anyone's listening hasn't been down to visit, it's an incredible tour. As you said, the equipment is state of the art. As cool as it is to go into a distillery and see this really old copper equipment, that has its own attraction and its own value as well. But also to see this distillery that is so flexible, shiny and new, and producing so much whiskey and also so much variety, as you pointed out, is really an experience.
Yeah, it's just a gorgeous facility.
Yeah, they've also got a great tasting bar that's not just Bardstown products, I should say, and a really good menu as well if you can get there for lunch. It's a little hard now. They're a little short of employees in that area, unfortunately. Who isn't? Yeah. But it's a really great place to visit. Yeah. So you were saying you have the mash bill for both the bourbon and the rye. You knew what enzymes you wanted to use, the yeast, the time, the temperature, the fermentation. This might sound like a really simplistic question, but how did you know that those were the specs that you wanted to use right off the bat? And did you have to do any tinkering when you saw the final product? The Whiskey Ring podcast is proudly sponsored by Impex Beverages.
Impex imports premium and rare whiskey, gin, rum, mezcals, liqueurs, and cordials from all over the world, from Scotland to Japan to Israel, Belgium, and Wales. Whether it's Kilchoman, Penderyn, Portiskeag, Glenallachie, Ohishi, Fukano, M&H, Ardnamurchan, Black Tot, and more, there's guaranteed to be something in the Impex portfolio you'll love. Impex also oversees some of the most prestigious independent bottlers in the game, including Single Malts of Scotland, Single Cask Nation, Adelphi Selection, and its own Impex collection. Take a look at their site, impexbev.com, or reach out if you're curious about their offerings. I'm proud to have many of their bottles on my shelves and love sharing them with friends whenever I can. Thank you to Sam and to the team for joining the Whiskering Podcast as guest and sponsor. And now, a word from our newest sponsor. The most exclusive whiskey in the world can't be bought in a store. Born in Edinburgh, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is the world's largest whiskey club, with over 30,000 members worldwide. They bottle each cask of whiskey as is, no diluting, no artificial coloring, or chill filtration. With new whiskeys released every week, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society offers the opportunity to taste spirits straight from the cask. I've been a member for over 2 years now, and I've loved the chance to explore my favorite distilleries with truly unique offerings, in particular from distilleries 4 and 53, and discovering new single malts not available anywhere else. Not a Scotch fan? No problem. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society releases 20-plus bottles each month to its members, including, yes, Scotch, but also including gin, bourbon, rum, and more. In fact, my favorite recent bottling was a corn whiskey from the largest family-owned distillery in the U.S., aged 11 years in new oak and bottled at cask strength. This is a bottling that people have clamored for years, and it was only available to Scotch Malt Whisky Society members. If you're interested in joining, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society has graciously offered a discount to listeners of this podcast. Use code WRP, short for Whiskey Ring Podcast, at checkout for 20% off an annual membership at smwsa.com. That stands for Scotch Malt Whisky Society of America. I will also be putting the link and code in my bio and show notes for this and upcoming episodes. Thank you to the Scotch Malt Whisky Society for joining the Whiskey Ring Podcast as our newest sponsor, and please visit smwsa.com with code WRP for 20% off your annual membership.
Actually, the only tinkering we had to do for the second round was we adjusted the set temperatures. The temperature after the mash has been cooked, you cool it down, okay, before you put it into a fermenter. In their fermenters, they have cooling coils, so they're able to control the temperature. If you don't have cooling coils, and in the heat of the summer, that mash, it generates heat. The yeast interacting with the sugar and converting it into ethanol, puts off carbon dioxide, and so it gets pretty hot. And so if that heat gets up to, 93 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, it starts killing off the yeast. And so you end up getting much lower yields per bushel of grain. And so the second go around, the only thing we really tweaked was just the set temperature. We didn't set it high enough in the fermenter given that time, and that's still early in the process. They were still kind of learning their equipment and so forth. And so we didn't put it high enough, and didn't give the yeast time enough to work. I think we came out with somewhere around like 4.8 proof gallons per bushel is one of the measures we use, and typically it should be around 5.2. So ever since then, it's been at least 5.2 proof gallons per bushel of grain. And so but that's the only thing we had to tweak. I mean, as far as why I came up with that, again, it's just I used my years of experience at Seagram's, at Brown-Forman, at Wild Turkey. To me, those were the ideal, given the mash bill that we created as well. Because that was another thing. A lot of people ask, well, was that the original mash bill that Chicken Cock used in 1856? And unfortunately,
that was my next question,
knowing that. Yeah.
So,
unfortunately, yeah, that's that information's not archived anywhere.
There was, of course, going to be one of my next questions. But with that said, have you or the team found any of those old Chicken Cock bottles, even from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and gotten to try them?
I haven't had the opportunity to try them. If you ever get down to Bardstown, you may have been there, David. It's the Oscar Getz Museum. I encourage people to go by there. Within that museum, they have the entire history of the whiskey industry in Kentucky. And it's pretty interesting, but they have some old pre-prohibition bottles. And some of those, they have some old chicken cock bottles on display there. Now, again, we haven't been able to try them. And people say, well, can't you taste the whiskey or do a chemical analysis and find out what the mash bill was? Now, when you distill that, you pretty much destroy the DNA. So it's impossible to really tell what the original mash bill was. So basically, we tried to shoot for a mash bill that we felt was representative of the brand during that time period.
Makes sense. If they figure out a way to kind of do one of those syringes through the corks or something to grab you some of that from the Getz Museum, I don't think you can turn that down if they can make that happen.
Be hard.
But it's worth saying that you really can't. You can do a lot of chemical analysis and you can try to figure out the mash bills from a finished bourbon, but there are so many variables that go into it. It's really not. It's not feasible in the way that people think about it. I mean, we should also mention we can't recreate things from 30, 40 years ago, let alone 100 years ago the way they were. I mean, grain is different, wood is different, environment's different. There are so many things that are different than it was back then. It's just not possible. But
very much so. Yeah.
But still, the intention is there from you, from Madi, from the team to create a product that is worthy of the chicken cock history and name, and that can revive it to the reputation that I think it has now achieved. You might still get a laugh at the name, fine, whatever. But
yeah, you'd be amazed the number of comedians out there, David.
Yeah, I know, I believe it. But once people taste the whiskey, I mean, again, Aaron, who set this up for us, was generous to send me samples of both chicken cock rye and bourbon a couple months ago now at this point, and I got to try it. I had no expectation, good, bad, otherwise. I knew nothing really about the brand, so I went in pretty blind, neutral. I was really impressed with it. I enjoyed it, particularly the bourbon, and I think I'm almost out, so I might need to get some more, but this time I'll grab the bottle myself. So now getting into the real meat of what we're talking about. And this is kind of how these episodes go. Like, I know we've been talking for about 45 minutes and we're just getting to kind of the meat of the subject now, but we go on tangents here. We go in rabbit holes. That's the whole fun of it. So one of the most unique things about chicken cock is what I consider the vertical integration that you guys have, that you as the master distiller can control everything from grain to barrel, everything in between. Not only can you control it, but you can also do all of the things in between as well, which is a very unique position and skill set for a master distiller to have. For you, what do you think that adds as a master distiller that I hesitate to say another master distiller might not have, but of course, being able to know the cooperage and all of this, and being able to pick mash bills and enzymes off the top of your head, you have an additional skill set. So what do you think that additional set brings to your role?
Well, throughout my career, one of the things that I've always stressed in my various roles of management is, in order to establish consistency, not just consistency in itself, but consistency of high quality, is the more processes you can control, the better chance you have of achieving high quality consistency. And the same thing with making good whiskey. Okay. From the whiskey side, from the mashing, the cooking, the fermentation, the distillation, we've got a great handle on that. But I mentioned earlier that 60 to 70% of the flavor in a great bottle of whiskey actually comes from that white oak barrel. And so through my experience in the cooperage industry, I basically for chicken cock, and one of the things that makes chicken cock so unique from any other whiskey that I'm aware of is that I have oversight from bark to barrel to bourbon to bottle. When I started my consulting company, another one of my early clients was a group in West Virginia. Don't know if you're familiar with White Sulphur Springs, but there's a beautiful exclusive resort there called the Greenbrier. And in those Appalachian Mountains, that's all that's there. It's pretty economically depressed, but there's a group of guys that they're pretty fluent, and they got together one Christmas party and they said, you know, what kind of business can we start to create jobs for this area? And one of the guys in that group was a guy by the name of Tag Gallion. Tag is one of the co-founders of Smooth Amber Distillery in Maxwellton, West Virginia. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but Pernod Ricard ended up acquiring that distillery. And but Tag's a great guy, and he was telling these guys, you know, here past couple of years, I've had a hard time getting barrels. He says, you know, in these Appalachian Mountains, we got all kinds of white oak. Instead of seeing those trees cut down and shipped overseas, you know, why don't we cut them down and make barrels and create a cooperage? And so they all agreed, and they reached out to a consultant they were using. And he picked up the phone and called me right away and said, hey, Greg, this is in your wheelhouse. You want to take it over? So I did, and worked with these guys. And we created a business called West Virginia Great Barrel Company. You know, I helped them design their cooperage. I helped them design their stave mill. Once they got the stave mill built, I went out and I trained their employees how to quarter saw white oak, you know, how to cut staves and heading, you know, what defects to look for, how to edge it up, how to properly stack it so you get good airflow through the stack. And then when they got the cooperage built, I went out and helped train their employees how to build a quality barrel. And so through that relationship for chicken cock, I go out a year in advance and I go to their stave mill, to their log yard, and I personally select the logs that we're going to use to cut in the staves and heading, and we're going to let it sit outside in natural air dry for 10 to 12 months. For the following year, when we can bring it in, we'll build the barrel and actually fill those barrels from the logs that I selected. And when typically the way it works now is when I get the schedule at Bardstown Bourbon Company, about a week and a half before we're scheduled to make our bourbon or our rye whiskey, I'll go back out to the cooperage. We'll pull in the staves and heading that we cut last year from those logs I selected. Now I'm there to oversee the production of the barrels, to make sure the barrels are constructed properly, to make sure they're toasted properly to our medium plus toast specification, and then make sure they're charred properly later in the process to number 3 level char. And so, you know, having control over that, again, it gives you a tighter control over the processes involved through every step. And I taste our whiskey every 6 months. That it matures in warehouses there in Bardstown. And I'm telling you, I don't believe in accelerated maturation. You talked about the TerraPure process, and that was kind of their whole emphasis was, well, we're accelerating the maturation. I'm sorry, you know, I'm not knocking them, but I don't believe in accelerated maturation. You still need time and temperature changes. However, in 4 years, when I create so much more flavor that's available in that white oak, I can extract that much more flavor. So in 4 years, our bourbon is tasting closer to 6-year-old bourbon, just because of what we've been able to create flavor-wise in the white oak to be able to extract out that same time period.
Yeah, it's really an amazing story to basically create your own cooperage. It's to me, it mirrors what Brown-Forman has been doing for many years, as we're noting, for having their own cooperage. And yes, a lot of it goes to Jack, of course, but goes to, of course, Woodford, Old Forester, all these different brands, but they're choosing their own cooperage. They're overseeing it. They're making sure it's to their specifications. One thing I wanted to ask a little bit more about was the choice to air dry for 10 to 12 months. In the industry, we see anywhere from like 6 months to at the extreme end 4 years of seasoning for staves, or for the oak that becomes staves. What about that particular age range really sung to you when matching it with the whiskey?
So, to your point, I'd say the far majority, and I'm saying probably at least 80% of the distilleries in Kentucky, they have no natural air drying requirement and specification. As soon as they can get those staves in the heading cut, the cooperage has to get it in their pre-dryer. It's going to take about 30 days, about a month's time at 90 degrees Fahrenheit with air blowing constantly on those staves and pieces of heading to get it down to 20% moisture. Once it's down to 20% moisture, then you can take those stacks of staves and heading and you can put them in a kiln and expose them to 150, 160 degrees Fahrenheit and finish drying them down to the 9 to 14% moisture that it has to be before you actually machine it and cut it cleanly and build the barrel. Again, that 9 to 14% moisture is critical. If you got staves and heading that's coming in too wet, the wood doesn't cut cleanly. It just tears. And so you don't get a nice, good, flat, smooth joint, and you'll have leakage problems. And so typically most barrels, they're pre-dried and kiln dried. And again, if you do it properly, that takes probably 5 to 6 weeks at the most. And so they turn around quicker. Now,
right,
to natural air dry it, that's a lot of money. White oak's not cheap. And so that's money sitting on the ground. It's a lot more expensive requiring natural air drying. Okay. What happens in that process, and the reason that I believe in the natural air drying, two things. One of the things that I'm looking for when I select logs, I'm looking for extremely tight grain oak. By industry standard, tight grain means at least 10 annual growth rings per inch. If you look at the end of the log, you see the annual growth rings. 10 annual growth rings per inch constitutes a tight grain. And those Appalachian Mountains, I mean, that soil is rough and rocky, and the trees are on a north-facing slope, aren't getting the sunlight. And so there's an extremely high percentage of tight grain oak. They're averaging, the trees that I select, they're probably averaging at least 12 to 15, if not more, annual growth rings per inch. Now, what that does, it gives you such a high concentration, a high density of the chemical composition that's in that white oak that you can convert into a lot of the great flavors. And so that's why I'm selecting tight grain oak. Now, natural air drying. When we natural air dry, what happens, you want the rain, you want the snow and the wind and the hot and the cold hitting and exposing that wood. What it does, it creates a fungal growth on the outside. You'll see it starts turning gray and gets a little greenish fungal growth on the outside of the wood. And so within that fungal growth, the microbial activity starts degrading the cellular structure and opening up the cellular structure of the grain of the wood to where when the rain hits and the wind blows, it leaches out, pulls out a lot of the harsh tannic acid and bitter phenolic compounds that you don't want to impart in the flavor of your whiskey. And so, again, it's a twofold process. I'm leaching out those undesirable flavors, but I'm also opening up the grain so later in the process, when I build the barrel, I can get heat deeply penetrated into that wood to reach those chemicals and make the conversion. One of the reasons white oak is used, and pull out the shepherd's hook if I get out on a tangent here too much, David, but okay. White oak contains a substance called tyloses. Tyloses is a membrane that lies on the inner surface of the cell. And when that tree is cut or goes through hardship, that membrane collapses. And so when it's quarter sawn, it won't leak. Now, when I say quarter sawn, basically, if you flat saw, you just keep cutting the same piece of wood. And what happens is you see that big wide flowery grain pattern on a tabletop or desktop. That's flat sawn. The medullary rays, which is basically the vein structure, goes vertical through that piece of wood. By quarter sawing, those medullary rays actually stay horizontal no more than 45 degrees. And so that piece of wood won't leak. Other species, red oak, pin oak, maple, cherry, they don't contain tyloses. So if you try to make a barrel out of those species of wood, they leak like a sieve. So that's one of the important chemical compositions. The other thing is that white oak contains, other than oak lactones, contains cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Cellulose is a primary cellular structure that makes that wood hard and strong. The hemicellulose is where the polysaccharides are, the wood sugars. And so when you build that barrel, you take the staves that have been freshly jointed and planed, and they start raising the barrel, and they start putting those staves and fitting them tightly together in a temporary truss loop. And then that barrel will go through a steam tunnel, and they'll make it more pliable with heat and with moisture. So when it comes out, they got a big cone that comes down and pulls those staves together and bends the staves, and they put a temporary hoop on the other side. One of the things I helped the guys design at West Virginia Great Barrel Company is a heating carousel. It's clean heat. What they do is they take the outer shell of that barrel. Doesn't have the heads in it yet. It's just the outer shell. The staves have already been bent, and they set it on a turret. And that turret spins as it goes around this carousel. But before it takes off, there's an infrared heating element that comes down inside that barrel. It's 36 inches in length. It goes from top to bottom of those staves. And right away, it's putting off about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so since we've already natural air dried, I can get that heat deep into that wood. And so the hemicellulose, getting back to it, chemistry 101, you took sugar in a spoon and you held it over a Bunsen burner. Well, it starts melting and caramelizing. Mm-hmm. That's where you're getting your caramel flavor. So by heating up the inside of that barrel and driving that heat deep into the wood, we're converting that hemicellulose into caramel substance. Likewise, when you toast that barrel, the third component, lignin, when you heat lignin up, it converts it into vanillin, and that's where your vanilla flavors are coming from. So we're getting it deep into that wood. Now, later on in the process, before the heads are put into it, we're going to char that barrel. And I'm only going to char it a number 3 level char. There's 4 levels of char, 4 being the heaviest and deepest. I just created a bunch of great flavor. The last thing I want to do is burn it away. And so I'm only going to give it number 3 level char. I just want to blister the surface just enough to create that charcoal filtering effect and allow good penetration of the whiskey into the wood passing through that char layer. Again, the char layer, a lot of people think that the char layer gives it flavor and its color. It may enhance the color a little bit, but the charring its primary purpose is charcoal filtering. When you put whiskey in that barrel, you taste the corn and the rye and the malted barley. The grains are heavy. And so through the maturation, the heating of the summers and the cooling of the winters, it's pushing that whiskey into that wood, passing through that char layer. And that char layer, acting like a charcoal filter, strips out the graininess flavor, and it picks up all those great sweet caramel, vanilla, and oak black tones, and then pulls it back out. And so through that movement in and out, it's passing through that char layer. So the char layer's primary purpose is charcoal filter. We talked a little bit earlier about economics. Again, I'd say 80% of distilleries in Kentucky, their barrel specs are a number 4 level char, no toast. Mm-hmm. Again, they don't have any natural air drying. It's, just get it dried as quickly as you can, and let's get the barrel in here quickly as you can. And a number 4 level char, no toast. Well, to natural air dry that barrel and to toast it before you char it, you're probably looking at least 20. In today's situation, you're probably looking closer to $50 extra a barrel to do those processes. Again, that's interest money sitting on the ground out there when it's natural air drying. It's a lot of money in that white oak. And so, again, I'm not knocking anybody, because all distilleries are making great whiskey, but when you do it a number 4 level char, you're going to get about 1/8 inch of char on the surface, and just inside there, you're going to get about 1/16 of an inch of that red label, which is a conversion of the hemicellulose and lignin. So you're actually utilizing 3/16 of an inch of that 1 inch thick stave. Well, the whiskey's going to soak a 1/2 inch into that stave during the maturation process. So there's 5/16 of an inch of flavor that you didn't create. And so again, not knocking those companies, they're getting make some great whiskeys they're satisfied with, but what we're able to do, we're so small, and I'm able to focus my time and attention on creating as much flavor, penetrating that heat deep into there and converting all that flavor, a good full 1/2 inch into the wood, and creating much more flavor that wood has to offer by going through the process and paying attention to detail.
One of my favorite things getting sorry, that was so much good information. I'm processing it as I'm trying to speak, and I should really take a second, because it's one of the best descriptions of what happens during toasting and charring that I think we've ever had on the podcast. One of my favorite souvenirs from a distillery is taking a barrel stave. I know a lot of people are kind of, it's in vogue to make a stave wall. Like right now I'm using a virtual background. I want to make a real one.
Yeah, I love it in the background.
Yeah, this is a great picture. I love it. But I want to make a real one day. And I want to be a real boy. But one of my favorite things to look at is that the penetration line, the red line of where
the soak line. Yeah.
the soak line of where the
Yep.
whiskey got to in the wood. And I think this is you're the good person to ask on this. Is some of the time I see the soak line and it's getting pretty deep into that wood. And I'm just curious, is there a situation in which the soak line would quite literally just reach the outside of the barrel, or are there natural processes that stop that from happening?
No, it can. If that barrel's not constructed properly, there's no question. Back when I was in the cooperage business, again, white oak's expensive, and the material cost itself is back then it was 60 to 70% of the overall cost, and so they tried to what they called save wood. In other words, when they joint staves, they would join them by hand. They don't have the latest technology equipment back when I was there, but they'd use these big wheels that had knives that they'd set in there, and they joint wood, and they try to leave what they call saw marks. In other words, you didn't want saw marks going halfway through the stave. And so if you had two staves that had saw marks on them from where the stave was originally cut, but it had a smooth joint at least halfway through the joint, you get two staves that had saw marks. I mean, you could see, an eighth of an inch gap. It may not be leaking, but you have an eighth of an inch gap. Now, summertime comes around and those barrels expand. I mean, I've seen barrels in the warehouse that look like the Michelin Man. They're bulging between the hoops, okay? Yeah. And so what happens when that expands and that whiskey's already soaked halfway in there, if you got those saw marks, guess what? You just create an opportunity to lose some whiskey through leakage. So again, there's a number of things, and I think over time, it's still important to not waste wood. By the same token, with the latest technology, a lot of the CNC planers and joiners, I mean, they're giving you a good clean joint all the way through the thickness of the stave. They're not worried about saw marks. Still concerned about saving wood, because if you lose that concern, you're not going to make any money.
Right. So one other question on the cooperage, and then I promise we'll get to the product at hand, is I only noticed this on my most recent trip and in one of the distilleries, that around the head of the barrel, where the barrel head meets the cooper's, what is it?
It's the crows of the chine.
Notch. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, the notch is called the crows, and the staves that stick above the head is called the chine.
Right. So where the head meets the crows, there's a paste of some kind. It looks like a glue, but a paste. Apparently, sometimes it's just simple flour and water. I don't think I'd ever noticed that before. I'd certainly never heard of it, or I don't remember reading about it. So, what is that paste used for? And
I don't know about a paste. Some of the old coopering methods, they would use the paste to help seal the bead of the head into the crows itself. Well, I think what you're probably seeing, is it clear or is it white looking?
I'd say clear to a little cloudy, but
okay,
probably
clear
more
to
clear.
cloudy. So what that is, David, I go back to my Seagram days when we would get barrels, and we had our own cooperage back there, actually in Memphis, Tennessee. Seagram did at the time. But we had a product called Geon, and it was a latex-based sealant, and we just put it over the crow's area and the ends of the staves, the chine. A lot of times when whiskey soaks into that stave, a lot of the evaporation will find its way up through the stave structure and out the end of the chine, at the end of the staves. And so by sealing that, you retard some of that evaporation loss. And Seagram's did that. Number one, to kind of help control and get more gallons out of a mature barrel of whiskey by trying to eliminate some of the evaporation loss. It's still going to evaporate, and you need to do that through the maturation for it to properly mature. But then the second important piece is the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds. When that whiskey ethanol, the angel share, as they call it, well, that contains volatile organic compounds, and there's a mold. I'm sure you've seen around a lot of the distilleries, a mold that's indigenous in this part of the country, and it loves the carbon in an ethanol molecule, and it feeds on it. And that's why you look at a lot of these warehouses or trees on the distillery, and they're black with that mold.
It makes sense. It was just something that I had never seen before, and
Yeah, not everybody's
know.
doing that. I see some companies still do it. Seagram's did a study, and it showed that it improved, the outages by a little bit. But every penny counts, especially back in the 1970s when we started using it. The finance people were looking at ways to cut costs because sales were going down.
Right. As in, the vodka, the gin, the clear spirits all coming up, and
they did.
The dark days of whiskey. All right, so we have come to the product at hand, which is the new one, the Chicken Cock Island Rooster.
So you said you had a bottle of our bourbon and a rye, and then there are Chicken Cock Island Rooster. We have two bottle designs actually, and both of these bottles are actually replicas of pre-prohibition bottles that Chicken Cock used many years ago. And so back then they were pint size, but we just took the same bottles, blew them up to 750 milliliter, and then made replicas. The Island Rooster is one of our what we call LTOs, limited time offerings. Every year, Grain and Barrel does a couple of LTOs, and back in 2021, Marty and I, along with some other folks, had a discussion about LTOs we wanted to do for 2022. And I told Marty, I said, I really love the spicy, peppery notes of our rye. And I think it would be a great product if we could enhance it a little bit with sweetness. And so he agreed, and we acquired 25 rum barrels. And they showed up at Bardstown at Distillery in May of 2021. The day they arrived, I went down there, threw up the door on the trailer, climbed up on the trailer, and I pulled the bungs out of all 25 barrels and I nosed them. I want to make sure that they were freshly dumped, that nice, sweet rum smell. A lot of times when a container of barrels is stuck in a port somewhere or whatever, and in the hot heat of the day, or down in the Caribbean or whatever, they can turn sour on you. And so you got to be real careful. But every barrel was nice, sweet, had great rum smell. And so I put our rye in it, and I would check it every month. One of my biggest rubs with finished whiskey is that you don't want to allow the secondary barrel to overpower the flavor of the base whiskey. You just want to enhance it. And so that's what we did here. I wanted to make sure it didn't get too much rum, too much sweetness. And so I check it every month. After 6 months, I said, boom, that's it. We're going to dump the barrels now. I don't want to add any more sweetness to it. So in November of 2021, we dumped those barrels and we held that whiskey in a tank. The Grain and Barrel didn't want to bottle it to the first quarter of 2022, being an LTO for 2022. And so we actually bottled it at the end of February. But I absolutely love it. It's 95 proof. And again, that's one of the things that I personally worked on. Our bourbon and our flagship bourbon, our flagship rye, they're both 90 proof products. And what I try to do in my commitment to providing a high quality product is that I start knocking down the proof till I get to the point where the alcohol burn subsides. It allows the flavors to really overtake the profile. And every whiskey is different, where that point is. We could bottle it at 80 proof and get a heck of a lot more bottles per barrel out from a financial perspective. But the true commitment to maintaining that high quality reputation is that, that's why our flagship brands are offered at 90 proof, and this one was 95. I tried it at 86 proof, it was too diluted. Tried it at 90 proof, too diluted. I kept bumping it up, 92, 93, still too diluted. But at 95, boom, that's when it really popped and the flavors really expanded and overtook the profile. So that's why it's at 95 proof. But I just absolutely love it. I think we accomplished the goal of maintaining the rye characteristics, the nice, spicy, peppery notes, and just with enough sweetness of the rum, a little molasses, sweet flavor, even though the rum is actually sugarcane based rum, whether the barrels originally were. It just the right amount of balance. It's so good. It's my favorite go-to for an after dinner drink. I'm not a big dessert guy. Not big on sweets, but I do have a sweet tooth every now and then after a great meal, and I'll pour a little bit of this in a Glencairn. Oh my gosh, just neat. Or if it's hot outside, I go sit by the pool and put an ice cube in it, and man, I'm in heaven. So,
no, I agree. I just love the balance of it. Balance is a big thing for me. I am a proof hound at sometimes, so I do love a higher proof spirit, but particularly when it comes to finishing, that balance between getting the flavor of the finishing without overtaking the whiskey is a very fine line. and it's one that I think many distilleries, and I'm confident in saying many, are still trying to figure out where that balance is.
Sure.
The,
there's no written script for that. It's
right.
a lot of it's trial and error and using your experience and knowledge, but you got to taste it. You're right.
Yep. And of course, the two products that I immediately think of that this will go next to in terms of if you're doing a side by side, one we mentioned earlier, which was the Angel's Envy rye, finish in rum, and then the other one I would put there would be Doc Swinson's Alter Ego rye, finish in rum. I don't know if you've had that one.
I haven't tried the Doc Swinson's, no.
Yeah. So they're they're a smaller company out of California. They buy MGP, and the head blender there, Jesse Parker, I was actually just talking to him last night about, because he's got a whole new line of finishings that he's come out with. Something that's very important to him is exactly what you said, and he said it almost verbatim is what you said. I want to try these finishings. They should match up with the whiskey, but they can't overtake the whiskey.
That's right.
It's got to be a balance. And when I first spoke to him about a year ago, we were comparing just the two, the Angel's Envy and his rye. And the Angel's Envy was very desserty. Tons of maple, tons of sugar, very sweet. Has its place. I don't think it's bad. Has its place. But his rye was much closer to what you're doing at Chicken Cock with Island Rooster, where the rum and the rye are meant to balance each other out and elevate the two together into a greater whole than the sum of its parts.
Well said. Yeah.
And so to dig into that a little bit more, and that means that both of them are by necessity. They're of course sweet because they have some rum in there, but they're not dessert sweet. I don't think. You could have it for an after dinner. It's delicious that way. Trust me. It's really, I'm not talking to you, but to the listener, it's delicious at any point in the meal, but it doesn't have to be a dessert thing. It's really the point. And so the first question I have is, you mentioned that these are sugarcane rum barrels. Are you able to tell where they're from?
No, unfortunately, I had to sign a non-disclosure on that one, David. But I tell people, number one, they are sugarcane-based rum, not molasses, and they came from the Caribbean. So that should narrow it down a little bit.
Yep, fair. That does help, and I, of course, will always respect NDAs, part of the business at this point. But I couldn't get away with not asking.
Yeah,
so
no problem. You're not the first person that's asked, trust me.
No, of course not. All from the same, just still the same place?
Oh yes, absolutely.
All from the same place. Okay. Did you? I'm asking questions around the thing, of course. So, were you able to go to or try the potential rums that you were going to finish, and kind of select which one you wanted, or was this the one that kind of happened to be available and it matched and you just went with that?
It happened to be available and it's good quality rum. So I said, heck yeah, let's do it.
All right. So one of the other questions you semi-answered in talking about how the rum barrels got to you, and of course what can happen to them if they're left to sit for too long before they're refilled. The timeline was about 6 months for the finishing. The first time around. But you also said that, and this was in another interview, you said that there was enough rum flavor in there, still in the barrels, to be able to use them a second time, maybe a little bit longer, 7 months instead of 6, which to me it's not a huge time difference in there. So my guess, and you tell me how right or wrong I am here, is that those barrels had to be pretty wet when they came to you to still, after the first 6 month maturation, have that much rum flavor in there to impart to the second batch.
That's correct. Yeah, actually they were. Yeah. So you're right. We did 2 rounds of it. The first round we bottled, it was a little over 1,000 6-pack cases. So a little over 6,000 bottles. And unfortunately, it was not distributed throughout the U.S. in our markets. We're in about, I think, 42 states, but it was allocated to certain states. And there was so much from a smell perspective. I mean, there's so much rum flavor still left in those barrels that we refilled them and did it again. And again, I aged them on the upper floor of a warehouse, the seventh floor actually of a warehouse. And so it kind of helps that process enhance it a little bit. But yeah, it took about 7 months, the second round, to get comparable to the flavor profile of the first round.
But still, again, that I feel like the 7 months, it's not like you needed 2 years as opposed to 6 months kind of thing. Like it's 7 months, just 1 month more is remarkable to me.
Yeah, it worked. I mean, tell you what, it's phenomenal. And again, it's all about, you said earlier, it's all about tasting, doing the sensory analysis, the nose, the palate, and making sure you got samples from the previous batch and the first batch to compare against.
Absolutely. So I guess the next perhaps obvious question is, you've done 2 rounds of it. It is an LTO, but are there any plans to try to do it again anyway as another round of LTO?
I haven't heard anything thus far. You never say never, I guess, but we've got other LTOs that we're working on. We're actually going to be bottling one here very soon. It's going to come out for the holiday season for the last quarter of the year. It's going to be called Chicken Cock Chanticleer. Chanticleer is French for rooster. And there's a lot of French connection there with, the bourbon history itself and bourbon whiskey. And, Bourbon County was named after the Bourbon family, who's a ruling family of France who helped America defeat the British during the American Revolutionary War. And of course, Chicken Cock was originated in Paris, Kentucky, in Bourbon County. And so, there's a lot of French connection there. And of course, the other French connection is it's bourbon that we finished in cognac barrels. And so again, different animal. Cognac is so powerful in flavor and overwhelming. And so you had to be real careful. And so this is actually a blend. The cognac barrels we were able to procure, we had different sizes of them. We had some 225 liters. We had some hogsheads, which are 300 liters. And so again, you're going to get some variation there. So there's a lot more blending to come up with the finished product. And so the actual finishing in the cognac lasted anywhere from, say, a month and a half up to 4 months in the cognac barrels. But the final blended product is fabulous.
That's to your point. That is really a very short finish to achieve that balance. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And actually, by the time, because of the way that the timeline's going to work out, so this podcast episode should air about just before I think that finish will be released. So we'll definitely be talking about it a little bit more, and I'll put a note out that it's coming out when the episode comes out. And I will say though, I'm going to have to do call it a home team versus away team side by side. So I'm going to have to do the Chicken Cock against the Bardstown Bourbon Company Ferrand. So you got 2 cognac finishes. Yeah. I love doing side by sides, not for the purposes of rating. I don't believe in doing it that way, but for the purposes of just seeing 2 ways that people can do the same thing on paper. I know a lot more goes into it. It's not the same thing, but the same thing on paper, and see what that is like. Yeah.
We talked about trial and error, and I know the first time that they tried the cognac finish, they really left it in there too long. So luckily they were able to blend it off with some younger stuff as well to come up with the Ferrand, which I like. I think it's delicious actually.
Yeah, I got to try it while I was down in Louisville at the Brown. So, and that was, I think, a 10-month finish, I want to say, which sounds a little long, but
it was pretty long.
It worked.
Good.
All right, Greg, I have taken an hour and a half of your time. I really appreciate you coming on. This was an excellent, fascinating episode. Learned so much about this. I'll throw you one last kind of softball question to close out, which is you're one of the rare people, and I think I would put you in the class of like Pam Howman, who I've talked to before, and just these people who have had about as wide-ranging an experience as you can have in this industry, from management to being on the floor, cooperage, distillation, everything. Someone gives you the option tomorrow to choose one part of that process and one part of the industry to kind of ride off into the sunset with. which one you going with?
I'll probably just ride off in the sunset because it's all important to me. It's all every aspect is so critical to coming up with the one quality product. And so I don't think that you can really just focus on one or the other. So at that point in time, if I've sold, that's the only choice I'd have, I'd probably go ahead and go into full retirement.
Fair enough. Well, Gregg, thank you so much. Again, you can find Chickencock through the website, I'll put notes to the website, to all social media in show notes for this episode. Again, the Island Rooster is out and available now. You can go to the Chickencock website to find it. About the time this episode comes out, the cognac finish should be coming out too, so I'll update you listeners on that as well. Gregg, stay on with me for just a second after we finish recording. Sure. And it's been another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. See you next week.